So, good evening. My name is Brady Plunger. I am one of the Associate Curators of Education at the University of Iowa Stanley Museum of Art. And it is my privilege to welcome you to tonight's talk, the final epic conclusion in our series celebrating this year's Grant Wood Fellows. Before we would begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our partners, the Grant Wood Art Colony, the Provost's Office, and the School of Art and Art History. I would be remiss if I did not also thank all of our friends of the Stanley Museum, and especially Yvonne McCabe, the sponsor of the Stanley's virtual programming this year. I would also like to extend a special welcome to 2015-2016 Grant Wood Fellow in Painting and Drawing, Neil Rock, and his students. It is so wonderful to have you all here, and it's always exciting when these talks can be a moment of bringing past and present fellows together. I'd like to say just a quick brief word about virtual housekeeping. We have live captioning for tonight's program. So if you go down to the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can click the little square with the CCs in it. We have live captioning, so you'll be able to enable those closed captions and follow along. We are also recording tonight's webinar, so if you would like to keep your face hidden, especially when we get to the Q&A, you can keep your cameras off. We will have Q&A at the end of the presentation, so we invite you to submit your questions using that lovely little Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen at any time during the program, and then Johnathan and I will come together at the end and open things up for conversation. And if you experience any technical difficulties, you may message my Stanley colleague, Joshua Siefkin, using the chat box, and he will assist you. Josh is our wonderful technical director this evening. And now it is my honor to introduce Grant Wood Fellow Johnathan Payne. Payne earned a BA in art from Rhodes College in 2012 and received his MFA in Painting and Printmaking from the Yale School of Art in 2018. In 2018, he completed museum leadership training programs at the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Studio Museum in Harlem. While at Yale, Johnathan co-curated exhibitions centering on marginal identities and their art practices, including Publishing Camp, Queering Dissemination in 2017, Queering Space at Yale in 2016, and Black Joy in 2016. His work has been recently shown at Deli Gallery, the Spring Break Art Show, and Jenkins Johnson Projects, all in New York City, the CMPLX in Memphis, and the Diane Rosenstein Gallery in Los Angeles. He is featured in New American Paintings and has been published in Observer, Vice, and The New Yorker. Please join me from wherever you are to welcome Johnathan Payne, and give us your best applause from wherever you are. We'll feel the energy. And now, Johnathan, I will pass it off to you.
Wonderful, thanks, Brady. Hi, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen in a moment. All right, awesome. Well, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to share my work with you. Again, my name is Johnathan Payne, and this is my Grant Wood Artist Talk. I've titled the talk Chronicles of a Queer Abstractionist of Color in the 21st Century. I titled this talk months ago, so I still stand by the title, but if there are any discrepancies as a result, be that as it may. So I would like to start the lecture by reading an excerpt from a text by Darby English called How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness. It goes, could a Black artist describe a painting in the following way without being taken for a fool? A pure, abstract, non-objective, timeless, spaceless, changeless, relationless, disinterested painting, an object that is self-conscious, no unconsciousness, ideal, transcendent, aware of no thing but art. Probably not. For it is not only that abstraction posed a problem for the Black artist, it has up to now been impossible for Black practitioners. The ease with which we accept the possibility held out by Ad Reinhardt's willfully ironic claim has everything to do with the fact that in the general culture of late American art, authority is connected with the privilege to suppress and protect the white cis hetero body, and the reference to social constraints the white cis hetero body inevitably unleashes, and all the more voluminously for Black artists. And I just wanted to share this excerpt because I think that it really sort of outlines what I have believed to be is somewhat of a double standard with regards to abstraction, at least in the modernist sense, and perhaps even still in the contemporaneous sense, but that um, this idea of an aesthetic purity um, and objectiveness is something that I like to push up against in my thinking of my work um, in the realm of abstraction. So I was born in Houston, Texas on June 21st, 1991. Um, I grew up in Texas for a bit, and then my family and I moved several times before settling for a bit in Scottsdale, Arizona when I was 7 years old. So between Houston and there, I lived in New Orleans, Columbus, Ohio, Colorado Springs. Lived in Arizona for 9 years, moved to Memphis when I was 16 and finished high school there and went to college there. Um, about 10 years ago, my parents moved to Montgomery, Alabama, which is where most of my immediate family is and where I go visit often. And in 2016, I moved to New Haven to pursue my MFA. Um, and now I currently live in Iowa City. But I just wanted to share sort of these places I've lived because moving and relocating has been something that has really defined my most of my life, and this sense of um, dislocation or multi-locality has really shaped me, and I believe it has shaped my work. So I want to start um, with this artwork titled "Breathe." It is from 2015. It is made using shredded comics and adhesive, and it is 84 inches tall by 132 inches wide. This is a site-responsive outdoor installation that was installed for the Terrain Biennial in Memphis, Tennessee. Originally started in Chicago Terrain exhibitions, aimed to bring art to the public by inviting artists to present temporary art installations in the front yards of their friends and neighbors. So I installed this work, and it was largely informed after reading Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which was published in July of 2015. The book is essentially a letter to his son, written following the acquittal of Darren Wilson, the officer who shot and killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, on August 9th, 2014. In it, Coates talks about the vulnerability of his son's Black body and the Black body in general, mostly from the context of the Black male body. I do want to point that out. But nonetheless, the book also outlines the history of race, racism, and police brutality and state-sanctioned white violence onto Black bodies through the lens of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I just found the text to be really powerful for me at the time, and um, it was really struck by it. And I was thinking a lot about my own personal vulnerability, but also a type of collective Black vulnerability um, um, that I was witness to in Memphis, Tennessee, um, on a daily basis. So the work was ephemeral in nature, being made of just um, shredded strands of comic books. And that ephemerality was really integral to the sort of the conceptual nature of the work. It embodies its own material vulnerability by way of its own degradation over time because it was left in this location, for several months. And so over time, the work itself started to disintegrate and get, shorter. And and that was really powerful to me. And this work really sort of led to an exploration of a type of sort of ephemeral based um, collage work is that I call my construction series. So this is a work that came after Breathe. It's titled Fill, Lil, Grown, also from 2015. So in addition to comic books, I started using colored printer paper and gravitated towards that medium for just the immediacy um, of it, and also its cheapness and the way that color was already predetermined in a saturated way that sort of afforded me an ability to sort of concentrate on the process. And so this piece, yeah, continues my investigation with constructions as a series, engages a complex, intricate, and color pattern system of teal and pink colors. And as you can see, the left side of the piece is predominantly made of teal strips with pink accents, and the right side of the piece is made with pink strips and teal accents. And you can sort of see um, a sort of a vertical demarcation in the sides of the left and the right. But there actually is a sort of a formula by which the accented strips are oriented. But I named it Phil Lil Grown because if you've ever seen the cartoon The Rugrats, Phil and Lil would sometimes um, trick people by pretending to be one another. And so Lil would give Phil her bow, and Phil would be Lil, and Lil would be Phil. It's a tongue teaser. And I just really sort of upon thinking about it at the time, I was like, wow, that's really powerful that was this first moment of experiencing a type of gender queering or um, sort of non-binary gendered performance circa this cartoon from the 90s. This is also a really large work. It's uh, I guess 124 by 124 inches. So, and then this is just an installation view of a couple of more construction pieces alongside Phil Lil Grown in an exhibition space. So again, these were really large works, and sort of straddled the line between vulnerable and powerful, in that their materiality was made of paper, but sort of at this scale, and depending on if it's folded or contorted in any way, it can really sort of take on a more sort of durable um, self-sustenance. And I just wanted to share a couple of drawings I was making around this time as well. These drawings that engaged sort of a mark making that is pretty synonymous with my drawing practice, but that sort of provided a different speed of hand in relationship to the collage works. These drawings also sort of showcase an interest in thinking about texture and thinking about um, fibrous material, weaving, hair, sort of how things undulate and curve and interlock on one another. So this work is titled Untitled Ddcc. It's from 2016. It is another construction work made of shredded comics and adhesive. It is 94 by 94 inches. So this is the first piece, I believe, that I started to think about the constructions as a multi-unit, sort of modular work. This piece is made constructing um, nine panels that then are pinned and arranged in a 3x3 grid. And it's aimed DDCC. It's partly a reference to DC Comics, although the comics I used for this piece were Coneheads comics, and that's actually a Marvel publication, but I digress. But DDCC also is a reference to double consciousness. And double consciousness is the internal conflict experienced by subordinated or colonized groups in an oppressive society. And so I kind of wanted to sort of engage subtly this idea or that concept sort of in this piece using a sort of a layered double diamond lattice pattern. And this is the detail of that work. So from afar, they have a different, like they're perceived a bit differently, at least I perceive them differently in terms of their color and then overall. And then the closer you get, the more you're able to see the detail and be able to discern the material of the comic book. So as Brady stated, excuse me, I did go to Yale for grad school. So I just thought, I don't know, there was a lot of mysticism and unknowing in terms of, what Yale was before I got there. And so I just thought at the very least, I'll include a couple of images of the Painting and Printmaking building located at 353 Crown Street in New Haven, Connecticut. This was one of the first pieces I've completed while in grad school that I felt good about. This is titled AKA Steel, a meditation, installation variation number 2. The original, when I presented this work originally, or for the first time, it was not installed in this manner. Hence the variation of installation being acknowledged in the title. But this particular work is made using shredded steel comic books, adhesive, and thumbnails. And just a little bit of backdrop on Steel as a comic and as a hero, a superhero. He's a Black superhero who is known as the Black Superman. He's named John Henry Irons in the comic, and which is a reference to the Black folk hero John Henry. John Henryism is a strategy of coping with prolonged exposure to stresses such as social discrimination by expending high levels of effort, which results in accumulating physiological costs. So that's pretty wordy to say that as a means of dealing with social discrimination, the subject works, twice as hard or tries to attempt to control their environment in ways that are incongruent with their mental and emotional health and physical health. And this sort of phrase was coined by a Black epidemiologist in the 1970s named Sherman Haynes. So I thought it was interesting upon realizing the connection between Steel, John Henry Irons, John Henryism, and then going about this work, how there's a reference to Steel by way of this perceived patina. The comics sort of take on this silvery, metallic kind of quality at this distance. But then also just thinking about the way that the work is engaging with gravity in a way that sort of creates these sags or these undulations where there's tension. And that tension is something that I think is congruent with John Henryism. And this is a detail of this work. So another text I would like to share an excerpt from is Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia, The Then and There of Queer Futurity. And for the purposes of time, I'll just focus on the two last paragraphs. Queerness is a longing that propels us onward, beyond romances of the negative and toiling in the present. Queerness is that thing that lets us feel that this world is not enough, that indeed something is missing. Often we glimpse the worlds proposed and promised by queerness in the realm of the aesthetic. The aesthetic, especially the queer aesthetic, frequently contains blueprints and schemata of a forward dawning futurity. Both the ornamental and the quotidian can contain a map of the utopia that is queerness. It is equally polemical to argue that we are not quite queer yet, that queerness, what we will really know as queerness, does not yet exist. I suggest that holding queerness is a sort of ontologically humble state, under a conceptual grid in which we do not claim to always already know queerness in the world, potentially staves off the ossifying effects of neoliberal ideology and the degradation of politics brought about by representations of queerness in contemporary popular culture. And yeah, I mean, I just really gravitate towards the way that Munoz talks about queerness, thinks about it in terms of of a um, a potentiality, of a futurity, of something that is yet to come. And also thinking about it in terms of a quotidian sort of makes me um, grounds my thinking in relationship to materials and processes that I've adopted in my practice. So to that end, in grad school, something that I wanted to try to do was sort of a better situate, or in my mind, better situate my work with regards to queerness. And so a way of doing this was engaging in queer imagery. So this is a zine by an artist named Christopher Scholes named called Pinups. And the concept of pinups is that each issue has a different model, and that it's a series of photographs, usually the model's naked. And the zine itself can actually be deconstructed to create a large scale poster of the model. And this image here, gleaned from A.A. Bronson's Twitter account, sort of showcases this. It's hard to tell in this image, but the basically like the pages are, the image is enlarged and then broken into sections, and there's sort of like a Ben-Day dot quality to it. The image is in black and white, but there is a grayscale. And so with my issue and with this, large image, I decided to create a construction piece out of it, which resulted in this piece called Elijah's Feet. um, and yeah, so I guess the idea was to sort of take this queer erotic imagery and um, continue to further queer it through a process of obscuration. The images become dislocations and disidentifications of themselves. This one is most discernible sort of at the bottom part of the image or of the work, where these um, tassels have been sort of left intact, where the image sort of feeds into the tassels, and you can see the figure's feet. Also worth noting is that, if you were to deconstruct this object and lay out the strips side by side um, as they are oriented in this work, that you will see the original image in its form. So this work sort of it organizes the image in such a way that it remains its original integrity. Similarly, I took another image from this scene and from another image from a later issue of this scene and created another construction piece. So I instead of using the poster, I used a singular image and then blew it up in Photoshop and then did some color editing work, which I then constructed or deconstructed into this construction piece titled Watermelon, Akram Doing a Handstand. And so this work incorporates hand cut and shredded processes, and I believe, yeah, that's all I guess I have to say about this one. But oh, I guess one other thing, the construction pieces at this time started to get a lot more sort of ornate and decorative in nature. I started to sort of experiment more with sort of curvilinear line work and volume, and I really wanted them to sort of have this this sort of domestic quality to them, while still retaining, their yeah, I guess their other aesthetic lineages. The 10th zine, excuse me, is a biannual publication that documents the history, culture, ideas, and aesthetics of the Black LGBTQ community. We engage some of the world's most talented artists and intellectuals in creative encounters to develop cutting-edge, Black, gay, unbothered content for each issue. So yeah, I think another big part of my time in grad school was, again, thinking about where does intersectionality fall in the work in terms of both queerness and Blackness, and so exploring queer Black imagery in this particular zine was important to me. And so, similar to the previous piece, I took an image from the 10th zine, the third issue, and created a construction piece where I enlarged the image quite intensely and then incorporated some more color editing work in Photoshop. And so that I created this called Yellow Bloom, a reconfiguration of Miles as he waits. It's from 2017. This is all cut by hand, hence why the lines are a bit thicker. And it is a work that is not flat, it curves off the wall. So there's tension built into these column units. And you can sort of tell, you can see the chin of the model in the middle column at the bottom, but I sort of rearranged the image's parts before constructing this. And here's an image of me standing next to it just for scale. And an installation shot of Yellow Bloom, aka Steel, and Elijah's feet in the pit, which is the critique space in the painting building at the Yale School of Art. So after my first year of grad school, I started to feel a bit dislocated myself. I was in a painting program, the world's best apparently, and yet I wasn't a painter. I didn't use paint, and I certainly wasn't a painter's painter, whatever that means. I felt somewhat at odds in the program given all of this. I had a desire to try painting, but didn't know how to incorporate it into what felt like already established processes in the studio. This is a work that I made during the summer between my first and second year, sort of as an exploration into painting and collaging in ways that were a bit different than previous, called Germinating Determinants. I believe at this time I had also seen, quite a bit of work in New York City, coming from Memphis, one of the best parts of grad school for me was being able to go to New York City to see art, and I went all the time. But around this time, or actually shortly after this, shortly before making this, I had gone to Chicago to see the Howard Dean Pindell retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And that was a really impactful show to me and continues to be. So I think I was still carrying some of that influence in this piece. Eventually, I couldn't stay too far, couldn't stay away from the shredded strip for too long. And I was able to sort of incorporate painting into what I had already been exploring. So this is a stencil that I created for a work titled Emanate that I will show you shortly. This is a stencil made with collage paper shreds that was then laminated, and then the negative space was then cut away to leave the positive of the stencil. And this has, a lot of sort of texture on its surface due to the painting of this, which is a site-specific wall painting in the pit titled Emanate, ITTMYS, which stands for It's Time to Make You Sweat. I painted this directly onto the wall, and he only used that stencil as a tool to create the pattern. So it's also a color system in that the farthest left and right columns are one application of paint on top of the yellow, and then the more you go towards the center, the more layers of paint are painted onto each column. So the red columns next to the first ones I described have purple and then red. The blue has purple, red, blue, and then purple, red, blue, purple, and so on and so forth. So by the time you get to the center, you can really see sort of this somewhat hypnotic quality of previous layers overlapping and shifting. And this sort of began my exploration of site-specific, large-scale works in my second year in grad school. This is also a choreography work that I had made in conjunction with Emanate, ITTMYS. And in this choreography, a lot of the dance moves were informed by the geometric qualities or patterning of the work. But I also thought it was sort of interesting to think about the wall painting as a ground for a space where activity and movement can occur. This piece was also a very ephemeral work in that it took me about a week and a half to paint, but was only on view for about 5 days because the space had to be sort of returned to its original state for the next week's critiques. This work is called Belly of the Snake, a Sanctuary. And so, yeah, this is a continuation of, as I said, the sort of site-responsive, site-specific painting installations, incorporating more stencils and expressive and gestural painting techniques, and also sort of, uses plastic sheeting as this thing to sort of obscure or encapsulate some of the more defined architectural elements of the space, like the windows and the lights and the ceiling and floor. This is the view from the opposite direction. And so I also created an entryway of, cut, painted plastic sheeting strips. And these are the three stencils I used to paint that space. and sort of the residual paint directly to the railing of the Green Hall Gallery, separating the first floor from the mezzanine. And this work is made using multiple colored parachute cords. So yeah, I macrameed this on site, and it remained for the duration of the exhibition, which was a week. I think this work also really connects to some of the earlier construction pieces in that, you know, the materials used are all sort of prefabricated color, all have a sort of saturation in terms of their color that, you know, I, you know, for a while had already, and you know, gravitated towards when it came to found color. And I just liked how, you know, queer it was. So I ended grad school with some conventional paintings. I have a few to share with you all. This one is titled Outer Limits from 2018. It incorporates comic imagery as a ground in the form of this middle band, as well as an acrylic stencil, an acrylic paint application used or made using stencil. This one's a microplastic self-concept beach. Which has dispersed collage elements and chunky and gestural paint handling. This one is titled Blue Boys 2018. It's made using custom risographs, which were made sort of copying the diamond-shaped stencil from the belly of the snake. Installation, and then also incorporating some elements from gay magazines, like figures that you can kind of see faintly in this. Blue Boys is also a reference to, I believe Blue Boy is the name of a video head clean, or like video cleaner, which you know, some of you may know as poppers. So after grad school, I stayed in New Haven for a bit, and you know, was working out of a room in my apartment that I shared with a friend, and so I, you know, was navigating, you know, sort of getting back to life as it was before grad school, or after, you know, trying to navigate work and financial stuff. But I continue to sort of explore the paper shred as a material, as a material that could be constructed into a ground, or into a substrate, and started to prime and paint them versus getting them laminated. I was really sort of feeling like the lamination process was starting to feel like a bit wasteful. So this is when I started to explore actually priming them with, you know, medium and gesso and such. And these were really small. These were actually made for a particular sketchbook, and so that's why they are this sort of size. But yeah, I also think that it really was the first attempt at sort of a more sort of complex color work. So this is titled Untitled Ds-6 from 2019. So I would say everything from here onward in terms of what I'm going to share with you as it relates to these sort of constructed paintings. They're no longer called constructions. I guess they're paintings. are they're all derived from a drawing that predates the actual object. And so I started to draw patterns out instead of relying solely on my intuition or experimenting with the strips as a means to sort of take the work in a more intentional direction. And so what we're looking at is basically like two sort of separate constructed patterns that have then been adhered onto themselves and then primed, but left the color of the primer. And these were small works. I also like to show images of my working space. And so this is my studio in New Haven, Connecticut. It wasn't large, but I had a wall and was able to sort of get a lot of things done in that space. But yeah, this I'll talk more about these two paintings that you see in front of you soon. But this is a really early sort of stage of where these two things were. And this was taken in October of 2019. So about a couple of months before I left New Haven, heading back down to the South. During this time between graduating and before, I guess, leaving New Haven, I also sort of returned to the comic imagery briefly. And so I made a few triptych paper weavings. We're looking at one here called Into Pure Energy. And these weavings incorporated sequential frames from comics where the protagonist or villain is in a state of transformation. They are weaved sort of 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and then 1 and 3. And the aim of these pieces was to break the sequential legibility of these images by collapsing them onto themselves. So another form of queering the imagery and sort of obfuscating and blurring their legibility. And this one is titled, "And Once Again, the Awesome Rays Weave Their Magic on the Being Who Stands Before Them." And this is taken from the original Incredible Hulk by Stan Lee. This is Bruce Banner transitioning from the Hulk back to himself, but in this orientation and in this sort of manipulation of the imagery, it's hard to tell. So there's a lot of text on this slide, and for the purposes of time, I just want to focus on the last paragraph. Though I really encourage you all to check out this text by Darrell W. Fields, "Towards a Black Formalism," and the book, I believe, "Architecture in Black." It's hard to tell because the banner is over it. But all to say, the reconstruction of the Black racial/spatial subject is schematic. The term schema suggests the interaction between the diagrammatic and the constructive. The schema, drawn through certain principles, is antithetical to preconceived taxonomia or taxonomy. While taxonomia represents all that is fixed, stable, and aesthetically routine, the schema is projective. It is a motivated system of representation that is reflective, structured, legible, and ambiguous. While taxonomia is always in the service of the discursive, the schema's relationship to language can only be intersectional. If taxonomia defines art, the schema projects it. And I just really, I think Black formalism as a concept is something that really fascinates me and something that I'm hoping to do more research on, and really sort of thinking about the ways in which a type of confronting of, racist hegemonic understandings of Blackness in this regard in relationship to Kant and to his text Observations on the Feelings of the Beautiful and Sublime, published in 1764, where he outwardly names Black people as ugly and stupid, is a way to is also part of the work of reconceptualizing and reimagining what formalism and aesthetics can really look like for Black people. I'm gonna try to go quickly, and so I apologize for the speedy slides that may follow. So yeah, last year, I went to Memphis, Tennessee to do residency that started February 1st at Crosstown Arts and located in the Crosstown Concourse building, which is what you're looking at here. For all the artists who are watching, I really encourage you all to apply to this residency. I think that they do an excellent job hosting artists, and it was really an incredible experience. It is where I was when the lockdown started last March. And so I did complete my residency there, though it was a drastically different experience being there. But we made do, so yeah, but they're good people there. Another studio shot. An image of, this is an image of a work titled Static Shock that you will see finished later in this presentation. But I just wanted to show how I go about making these objects. I collage them in parts on the table, so I'm sort of hunched over them, and then they get sewn or adhered and then sewn together. And then primed and painted. So yeah, there is a multi-layered sort of process to them, but yeah, I'm kind of into disclosure. So, like sort of just sharing it for what it is. During my time at Crosstown Arts, something that I really tried to work through was my relationship to color and color mixing and my understanding of color. So it begot me going through the process of sort of measuring color into these different quantities and then mixing them together to create a sort of index of my own of color swatches and formulas. And so each formula is written in the white section of the paint swatch. And I just use the Dixie cups as mixing cups. So yeah, Pete the Playgirl on the floor. Oh, yeah. These are some paintings in progress from May of last year that you will see finished soon in the presentation. So this is one of the few install shots I have to share of a two-person show I had last fall at Deli Gallery in Brooklyn, New York, titled Miss Lizzie's Lattice. I mounted this exhibition with a colleague and good friend, Lex Brown. And yeah, it was really fantastic. I have something to say about it. This show was really a way for us to explore the idea of the quote unquote grid, or more distinctly, the lattice, as a tool / emblem of Black, queer, and femme construction and augmentation. So I'll sort of leave it at that and show you some more images. So the three framed paintings that look like mine are mine. And they're interspersed with Lex's work, which are these drawings on drawings on paper mounted on wood, aluminum stretcher bar wood panels. This is Jewel. I date these pieces the year I started them and the year I end them, because they do take quite a bit of time to make, and I just want that time to be acknowledged in the dates. But this is acrylic and thread on shredded and collaged paper. So have some detail shots for you all because the details, are really important. So I'm using a sort of diluted paint that um, creates sort of color mixing, wet on wet effects onto the prime strips themselves. So you get to see like a lot more sort of nuanced paint handling sort of happening up close. It's not as sharp a demarcation as it looks from afar. And as stated earlier, like I said, all of these newer pieces come from a preliminary drawing that I make using gridded paper and graphite usually. And they start loose, but then they get more specific, and I use straight edges to make them. So this is a pattern study for a painting called Starburst. It is 10 by 15 inches. And also worth noting is that the actual paintings themselves are to scale with the drawings. So I'm always thinking about how something is going to be magnified or made more specific when I'm engaging in the drawing process. And so this is Starburst, the painting, 2019 to 2020. And again, it took a different turn in terms of color. If you remember the image I showed you of my studio at Crosstown, it was predominantly a yellow color, but yeah, a lot of times the color work is something that often changes and gets reworked, and you'll really see that in some of the later paintings. Again, acrylic and thread on shredded and collage paper. Some more details of this painting. This one's really chunky. This one's titled Daisy. Something about the way that the central form creates a circle with all these intersecting lines, and the yellow just kind of took me to this title. And some more details of it. Also last fall, I was able to take advantage of an opportunity to make a commission of small drawings for the New York Presbyterian hospitals. So here are a few of those drawings. And they really are actually really a further exploration of the drawings I started to do last year as well. So these are graphite and colored pencil on gridded paper. This is 6.5 by 8.5 inches, gemstone pattern number 1. This one's number 3. Number 7. So most recently this year, I was one of 4 artists that participated in a group show at Foxy Production called Threads. It also contained work by artist Ulrich Mueller, Steve Ranke, and Tuesday Smiley. And just to read just a brief description of the work. Threads is a group exhibition of works using textiles to visualize conceptual systems that are both personal and communal, where threads bound together to make fabric are lines constructing an imaginary that is reflective, questioning, and activating. The exhibition incorporates texture, pattern, and sometimes text that can be both symbolic and abstract, while retaining a tangible connection to narrative and material. So yeah, I feel really fortunate to be a part of this show and to have included 3 new paintings in it. So this is an installation view of the paintings installed. I unfortunately was not able to see this show. I just felt really reluctant to go to New York City at the beginning of the year, given the way that the pandemic was sort of raging. And so this was something that I unfortunately experienced only from afar, but I'm very grateful for those who were able to see the work, and to my friends who sent me pictures. So one of those paintings is titled Amethyst. This one is 35 by 35 inches. Taking on more of a monochromatic approach to these paintings with sort of polychromatic features up close. Though I don't have any detailed shots of these works, unfortunately. But this one is titled Static Shock. And you can sort of see underneath the gradation of the grayscale bands from center to top and bottom that there is a multi-hued undercolor work happening underneath the gray. And then finally, conjunction, acrylic and thread on shredded and collage paper. Yeah, named after the great conjunction that happened earlier this year where Saturn and Jupiter lined up. I guess also something worth noting in this presentation of these paintings is that instead of having them framed, we decided to pin them directly to the wall, which I think is a really beautiful way of presenting them. So we're almost done here. I just wanted to share some artists and exhibitions that I've seen over the last, handful of years, 4 or 5 years that have really impacted my work. Julie Moretu show back in 2016, the Agnes Martin show at the Guggenheim, We Want a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 65 to 85 at the Brooklyn Museum, MacArthur Binion's work I'm a big fan of. Soul of a Nation was absolutely phenomenal. Shout out to Ashley James for curating that show. Howardina Pindell, Where Remains to Be Seen. At the MCA Chicago that I mentioned earlier, Adrian Piper, A Synthesis of Intuitions, David Wojnarowicz, 50 Years After Stonewall, The Life and Times of Alvin Baltrop, and so many more shows. I really can't wait to see more art in person. And then I just wanted to share with you all what I'm planning to do this summer. I'm excited to share that I am the inaugural recipient of the Amina Residency in Columbus, Ohio. So between May 24th and August 23rd, I will be there doing a residency, living and working in the late Amina Brenda Lynn Robinson's former home located in Columbus. And I am just beyond thrilled to be to have this opportunity to continue exploring my work and to share in the legacy that is this artist. I'm really honored and grateful. And that's the end of my lecture with a piece from 2011 titled Right This Way, Gentlemen. So thank you all. If you're curious what I looked like a decade ago, that is me. And I appreciate you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Johnathan, for this talk and for sharing your work with us. And I love this piece. This is such like a wonderful note to end the talk on and to open up the Q&A. And we do have some questions in the Q&A box. So I think I'm actually going to start with Sean's question. Munoz said that we are not quite queer yet in 2009. Do you find that there has been a significant progression in the last decade plus?
Oh, that's a really good question. Definitely, absolutely. I would say that I don't know, at least I've been witness to it over the last decade, and just in terms of seeing more of a radical approach to engaging one's queerness, both personally, artistically, culturally speaking. I think I'm thinking about like Lil Nas X's like Montero as as an example of like the way in which like the younger generation is completely unapologetic and really sort of radicalized around self-empowerment. And at the same time, I think the the cultural context by which Munoz was writing from at the time was very different. I think that the orientation around gay marriage was something that he was, at least to my understanding, was wanting there to be a more radical form of LGBT like political mobilization and 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 really like I would say that like the situation that we're in now, where trans children and youth are being attacked essentially and vilified for wanting to play sports, is by the conservative right and Republican states. It's really like this issue where I think we're that's like the point of friction that I think like is the fact that we haven't gotten to that yet. I do think that like once the most marginalized are able to live free, we all can. So that has not happened yet. So I guess I would say no. I started off with yes, and then I was like, oh, but yeah. So, but thank you for that question. It was really incredible. Yeah.
And I think we have another question to kind of build off that, thinking about queering, like the act of queering. And, I wonder, I sort of want to combine my own question with a question from Margarita Blush, which, thank you, Margarita, for lighting up this Q&A, by the way. She's put a number of wonderful questions in here. But she asks, why do you think the image continues to be queered by abstracting it? And I would add to that to say, I felt like there was a point where you're sort of talking about, especially when you're taking imagery that's sort of ostensibly already queer, are there layers of queerness going on that are added and built up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something about queerness that's so, fungible or, slippery, is that we, I don't, it's like color. We all perceive it differently. We all have this different perception of it, relationship to it. So I think for me, and this was also a question I got a lot in grad school, like why there's a lot of sort of like no, you're actually shamed because you're like obscuring and like you're like repressed. And it's like I actually think that there, like, for me, there's layers to it. Like I particularly in the work of pinups, something that was a prevailing thing in my thinking was that I haven't seen like a model of color or particular a Black model image or represented, and that's not to call out or critique the artist who started the zine, but more so for me, I think, as the act of obscuring was this way of right, of kind of taking it another step further, and also creating a condition where which those who actually know the zine can be able to sort of articulate, oh wait, I think this is what that is. And so there is this sense of like trying to forge community through a type of formal semiotics, one could say, or like making it a bit, making the looking more rigorous. There needing to be more rigor in the act of looking. That it wasn't going to be given to you so freely, so immediately. Yeah.
It's thinking particularly about those pinup images. I mean, that was not a zine that I was aware of, and so I quickly looked it up on my phone, and thinking about how you take those images and take them another step. And I love this idea of collapsing and obfuscating, because I think that's something that can speak to a lot of people right now. Speaking as like an LGBTQ person myself, like there is a lot of self-discovery that goes on, self kind of work. And I think that's something that we're talking about more now, and that's something that's more accepted. And as I loved earlier when you said something about like the younger generations are being more unapologetically queer, and like it's the best time, right? And it's only there's so much flowering to be done. And I wonder, just staying on the idea of zines for a minute, like I have a question about you use zines and comics and these things that are kind of intimately scaled, And so can you talk about blowing them up and taking, how did you move from those intimate things to these much larger, the intimate source material to the much larger work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know where it came from, but um, I was making these really small drawings for a long time and really sort of intimately sized works. I mean, I had engaged in installation-based pieces before, but I just had this idea, like, I really just want to make big work. Like, I want the work to have a physical presence via scale that in some ways could like contradict the perception of its vulnerability, materially speaking. And I think this kind of came out of just discovering like fiber sculpture work and sort of thinking or seeing the ways in which this work sort of took up space in a way that was so radical to me. And I don't think it's yeah, not dissimilar from the ways in which some of these pieces engage in that type of radicality as works meant for the wall, but that also protrude out into space, where there is this desire for a type of consciousness on the viewer's part of like how they engage the object, or even in the case of like the site specific installations, like that's really where that sort of became a very like grounded desire for me as a maker, in terms of like I want the viewer to be aware of the act of looking at a painting or at an object, not passively but actively. And so like sort of creating the conditions where they're sort of subsumed in a space, um, or they're looking at a wall that's like, its loudness is undeniable. That's sort of that became really exciting to me. And yeah.
And I think I can stitch a couple questions together here to get, and thank you everyone who's bringing questions into the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with actually another question from Margarita that I think we can fold in with another question from another guest tonight. So Margarita asks, what is your primary draw to abstracted forms? And then Ryan Hill, I think we can kind of build on that to ask, can you speak more about symmetry?
Okay.
Maybe those shouldn't have been put together. I don't know. I'm building things here.
No, I think that's great. I mean, my relationship to abstracted forms. So I would say that I've always identified as a formalist. I mean, I would say even prior to the construction series, which began in 2015, I we would make these drawings that engaged in mark making in ways that were about sort of um, creating these like somewhat anthropomorphic, um, like fuzzy forms in space, and some of them were phallocentric. So I guess like abstracted form was a way for me to like engage in notions around like bodiliness or desire, or like um, hair, or like these textures that I was that I have, or like that I'm drawn to on other people. And then I guess like in terms of like the I don't know, I think in terms of like moving towards a more sort of defined aesthetic with like the grid or with geometric abstraction, um, there was this, yeah, this pull towards symmetry. That's a really interesting question, Ryan. I think a large part of it was like logistical factors. Having moved from a graduate studio space to my apartment, things kind of flattened out in a way that like begot thinking about how to construct the paintings in a more symmetrical way. And I also think that the way that the drawings came into the fold was really sort of um, instead of like sort of skirting around my interest in geometric abstraction out of maybe fear of like feeling I was I don't know, wasn't smart enough to do it, or like, wasn't qualified or something. I was sort of like, no, like, go for it. And so I think that like that's like when I finally gave myself permission to engage in the grid unapologetically, that's where I feel like the symmetry really came in. And then I just also am someone who's a bit obsessive compulsive when it comes to symmetry. So like, to be completely honest. So yeah, there's this not in the way in the work that like something's bad it's gonna happen or anything, but just that like I do understand like the symmetry to be about a type of control or discipline that I otherwise don't really feel in the world.
I I find that fascinating because I am also very drawn to symmetry and, those works of yours that, as that kind of, that order kind of started arising out of it, I was really, drawn to that personally. And, that I also like that comment you made about the kind of exigencies of space. And as you move from a studio to an apartment, these different things happen. And this is something we don't get to talk a lot about, particularly in, museums and display spaces. We sort of take the work out of those contexts and we sort of, in some ways, almost shove all that under the rug because we don't want to talk about it. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, and this is a question for me, about the labor that goes into these things, because even at these grand scales, there's so much intricacy and delicacy. How do you navigate all that and work on these, on this large scale?
Yeah, in fact, I actually would like to maybe go back to, um, yeah, I mean, I'll just stay here for a bit. Like, um, it was something 6 years ago that I was hungry for. It was like this this process-based way of working that for me like kept me in the studio, till the wee hours of the night, even though I had a day job, just, or really eager to get back to work and to like kind of see how this thing could multiply, how this thing could replicate, how this thing could grow larger. And so, and I think it kind of, I mean, I don't come from a background of, I believe myself to be from the deep south. I mean, I'm from Houston, but like I don't have like quilters in my family or anybody like that. I'm like, the only artist to my knowledge in my immediate family and extended family. So like for me, I think that labor comes from, yeah, I mean, I would say maybe a bit of John Henryism, as not to be self-deprecating, but just the sense of like I this internal sense of belief or faith in the pursuit of the construction of the thing. But also, I think as time has sort of progressed, like now, yeah, I mean, I really want these objects are sort of antithetical to a type of um, to a type of object performativity within the scope of capitalism. So like there's only so many of these I can make with comfortably, so like in a year, so I guess for me, but there is this desire for a type of intricacy, and there is this desire for a type of right repetition and pattern in the ways that the work achieves when there is this really concentrated effort. And I think that like going from the diagrammatic or the schematic to these objects has really sort of allowed me to think about what sort of um, intention or power they can have as as objects that are embodied or objects that are that embody my labor, with that degree of like intention.
That's so phenomenal. I love thinking about the labor of making art. I mean, I think again that's something we lose in the museum display space or the gallery space, because it's sort of meant to be this thing that was always meant to be and will always be, and we sort of, we don't want to talk about the labor, the time, the fatigue, the all of those different aspects. When, so many great artists, I'm just reminded of a quote by Matisse that I can't get it exactly right, but he talks about really what makes a great artist is someone who can come into their studio and work for 8 hours a day on the same painting and then come back to it for another 3 months and still have that clarity and create this work and then move on to the next one.
Well, I actually, to that point, that's such that just sparked in me this thinking about the actual painting process of these can be so cumbersome because I'm engaging in a different type of logic, almost an illogic actually, because I think that like there with painting, something that's really challenging about it is that it's all self-constructed meaning in the sense that like something not being right is a condition of a construct that you created, and so sometimes I'm really struggling to try to resolve the patinas of these objects, and that's like far after they've been constructed and sewn together and primed, which is all to say that painting is, as a artistic pursuit, is the labor of painting is something that I wanted to talk about in grad school, or I wanted to really engage in. And so I think that like that it's often overlooked how hard it is or how challenging, how time consuming it is to resolve a painting. And I think that my work attempts to sort of reveal some of those details.
Again, I mean, amazing. Like I'm just, I'm so drawn in looking at this piece, but we have a couple more questions and I know we're already kind of over time, but I do want to give these folks in the Q&A their due. So we'll have kind of this question is kind of more general, and then we'll move into two kind of more specific questions about your site-specific work. So Tony Coleman asks, how do you go about naming these pieces? I'm wondering specifically about the works that invoke minerals like Amethyst and the Gemstone series. Are those titles responsive to the work, a result of their processes, or does the work respond to the concepts, titles in which they are originals?
That's a really good question. Thanks for your question, Tony. I think that they're a combination of both. So for example, in Amethyst, I, designed the pattern, sketched it out, sort of immediately saw upon applying paint to it that there was this sort of like diamond jewel hat that I could not unsee. And so, and it, across the horizontal axis, it, goes from like tip up to tip down to tip up and, vice versa. So, and then, I think that kind of informed the way I was, thinking about, okay, what kind of color decisions do I want to make? And then also like, what title does this take on? I think when I made the sketch for this, I was listening to a podcast with Garth Greenwell and Brandon Taylor, and they were talking about queer beatitude, like beatitude. But all to say that like the Amethyst kind of came about in terms of thinking about like the merging of both the pattern and what I was observing to be like a really significant component of the pattern, i.e. this jewel-like shape, and then also the color itself. And the Foxy production has images where you can zoom in on them, but if you zoom in, you can see these sort of multi sort of layered color relations happening that kind of look like the way that a crystal or gem would sort of under light. It sort of has this sort of effect of like shimmeringness. With regards to these series, the gemstones, I guess I think that a gemstone or a stone like jewel was another title for another work. That kind of comes out of thinking about the way that jewels and crystals refract light, like the way that they're shaped, but also the way that they sort of bounce and send light in other directions. And I just kind of find that sort of spidering or spreading to be a really beautiful component of those things. Like glitter is something that you know, I like. I don't use it in my work, but like just thinking about the ways that these objects um, sort of emanate and share light is a really important and powerful thing for me. And then like things like static shock, I guess there is this like light mineral earth kind of thing happening. Starburst is another one, Daisy. Yeah, I guess just sort of paying attention to or being attentive to um, the dimensions of the work and the formal dimensions of the work and what they're doing and how they're doing it. Yeah.
I love thinking about crystals in art. I actually I'm not gonna like go on a long thing here, nobody worry, but I just have to say I did a bit of research in grad school about the like early 20th century modernism and crystals, and it's such a fascinating and rich area. And there's this like artists have been drawn to these forms in so many different ways, and it's so fascinating. I love the way that you are drawn to them and the way that your work kind of engages that, because it's so strong and it just like leaps out at you. Um, so from Tony Bodensteiner, I'm a child of the 70s and did a fair amount of macrame in my youth. And I'll just tell everybody that's the first time I've seen the word macrame written out, so I almost pronounced it wrong. Even art history people can mess up. Um, did you unknot intervention, or did you just cut it off the railing? And will you recycle the rope in a future piece?
Thank you for that question, Tony. And yeah, so for intervention, what I did was I zip tied the point before the first knot on the horizontal or like the line of the rail for each tie. So there is, yeah, I don't know how many zip ties that was, but they're all intact. And then I snipped the rope on the top of the rail, and I actually just I didn't undo the piece. It's just actually in a large box right now, but I totally would reuse that rope for another piece. But I also, there's a part of me that's like, oh, I don't want to take it apart. There's this weird part of like working site specifically where you make something that's ephemeral that gets covered up or whatnot, that gets removed, and you feel like you've lost like like a I don't know, like a Horcrux or like a baby. I don't know. I'm being dramatic. That's too much. I'm sorry, but there is like this, yeah, like the work is, I still have it intact and hope to maybe show it at some point in the future, but unsure.
And along with, we have one more question on intervention and then one other question, and then I promise we're done. But Margarita asks, did the parachute chords in intervention represent something?
Hmm. Now I want to go back to it real quick. Did they represent something? Thanks for everyone's eyes dealing with this. But, not particularly. I mean, something that I feel like I notice of the work, in this image at least, is that there is a strong dominance of orange in it, in the rope, but you look at it up close and you see, well, this is not a good example because there's orange in it, but like there is like a much more intricate or isolated color relationships. So I think for me, I wanted to use a variety of ropes, but I also wanted them to be bright and exuberant and saturated. I don't think that the colors have any particular meaning in and of each of themselves, but I think collectively, this sort of yeah, this sort of like loudness that the work conveys, yeah, is important to me. And I guess with the felt, I guess it kind of takes on a similar answer as the parachute cord. It's material that was used in museum education work when I was a museum teacher at the Yale Art Gallery. One of the activities we would do with the kids was give them felt kits. And so they would arrange different shapes of felt on a felt board, trying to sort of construct the formal or shaped components of a work that they were looking at on a tour. And I just thought that like that as the felt as a pedagogical material was really interesting to me, like a material of play and a material synonymous with children, at least in like my job. And so really kind of taking I guess color becomes this, functions in this work as a playful and as a sort of a de-institutionalized approach to thinking about it and using it.
I love this piece. I mean, I could look at this, like just all the textures and everything. Oh my gosh. And thinking about those, that connection to museum education, which of course as a curator of education, I am all about. But I do want to go one last question here from Ernest. Is there a relationship of the work, AKA Steel, a meditation installation #2, and the metal tapestry works of El Anatsui? One of the things that interests me is the affirmative location of Anatsui's works by some curators and writers as a continuation of modernist abstraction, which obfuscates the other relationships to Yoruba tradition. You seem to foreground these and other relationships that arise from the source material you've chosen in, for example, AKA Steel. Can you speak about that source material a bit more and how it functions for you? And if there's any formal conversation with the work of El Anatsui, as this is often a hidden aspect of his work? Big question. I think there's a couple questions in there.
Hello, Ernest, and thanks for being here, and thank you for your question. I just want to go back to that. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely El Anatsui and his work is a huge influence of mine, and maybe to the question of scale, Brady, like was a big proponent in me thinking about scale, thinking about how something can situate itself as an object in space on a in a with magnitude. I would say too, I mean, I guess at the time of this, around the time of the making of this work, or at least the thinking of this presentation of it, there was an El Anatsui work on view at the Yale University Art Gallery. And it was massive and huge. And something about that piece and the way that it was installed was rather conservative in nature, in that it was mostly pretty flat against the foam that was demarcating it from the wall itself. And in variations of or iterations of his work that I've seen, there's much more sort of undulation happening in the material. But yes, I mean, I'm interested in the way that El Anatsui uses the material of the liquor bottle caps, and really sort of is using a material that is a condition of a colonial and post-colonial sort of historical outcome to construct these really large pieces. And I think that for me, something that I felt I hadn't achieved before this work in regards to the use of comic imagery was really sort of finding or deepening a relationship to the meaning of the material itself. I think for me, there was this, at one point, I think my argument was that I was shredding comic books because I was trying to sort of confront a history um, of, of patriarchal storytelling that depicted, women and queer people in a very particular light. Still a pretty interesting thematic topic, worth exploring. But I think in the case of this particular work, I read the comic and then started to, and from understanding sort of, I read what people wrote about it in terms of like the the fan feedback that would come in the issues later, and then who wrote this comic, and it was co-written by a white man and a white woman. I'm forgetting their names, but also sort of feeling like, okay, the problematics of this aren't necessarily rooted in the authorship, because the story itself is being told, and there is complexity in this story. For me, getting to the point of realizing that like there is this connection between Steel, the superhero, and like superhuman strength, and being hyper muscular and hyper masculine, with this sort of epidemiologists' research around what it means to take on the weight of discrimination and racism as a Black person, really became like this. I felt lucky that I was able to come to that research with this work in a way that like I feel like is so hard to do in conceptual art. I'm like, okay, if this is gonna be like my most like conceptually rigorous piece of conceptual art, then like I'm happy. But like, it's hard, but it's also important. That research is important to me. I hope that answered your question, Ernest.
And we're back to labor again, right? Intellectual labor, physical labor. There is such a depth of of themes and of sort of vectors to follow through your work. And I'm gonna conclude the talk now, because we're almost at 9 o'clock. But I want to thank Johnathan again so much for your time and your energy, and the wonderful works that you shared with us today, and just your personality, and just bringing everything, giving us such a wonderful closeout to our lecture series. And I want to thank again the Grantwood Art Colony and the School of Art and Art History, who are such wonderful partners for us at the Stanley. And at that point, I'm going to invite everyone, we can kind of hang out for a minute if folks want to, if you all want to, kind of come on and say hello. But I'm going to stop the recording and let everybody take a collective breath and relax. And thank you all again for being here tonight.
Thank you, Brady, and thanks everyone.